video, I dive into homeschooling, viewing education through diverse cultural perspectives that challenge norms. I'm Dr. Emily Sherwood. If you're interested in educational policy and global education, please like and subscribe. So homeschooling is the practice of doing school at home, basically. And it's really hard to define that define what that looks like because there are so many variations on homeschooling. But homeschooling is a very big economic trend. Before COVID-19, about 3% of students in the United States were homeschooled, and now that's up to about 6% of students in the United States are homeschooled. So still a relatively low proportion of society in the United States, but it's becoming more and more common. And this is a very, very American idea. If you watch my video on individualism and communalism, you know that the United States is incredibly individualistic, the most individualistic country in the world. And so when it comes to education, there's this idea that children should have individualized education, should have educations that work for them, appeal to their interests, and also work for the family and promote the family's values. So because of that, homeschooling is a trend in the United States that's becoming more and more common. Homeschooling has been done for a long time. During colonial times, a lot of children were homeschooled by tutors, or they went to schools with maybe 3 or 4 other children, and there might be a teacher or a parent might homeschool. But modern homeschooling got popular again in the 70s and the 80s. First, it was kind of a hippie idea, the idea that children should be free from formal schooling and all the guidelines of that, all the rules. Then in the 1980s and early 1990s, it became tied to religious movements, particularly very conservative Christianity that had the idea of giving children a Christian education and an education that was not based on worldly ideas, and that children should interact with other children and other families. There's also this idea in a lot of homeschooling communities, conservative communities, that the family should be the ultimate authority in education. Not the government and not schools. And since then, and particularly since COVID, when a lot of families started homeschooling kind of by necessity because a lot of schools were closed or they were online, there's become a lot of diversity in homeschooling. There are secular homeschoolers. There are homeschoolers who are very religious based. There are homeschools for children who have particular hobbies and talents. For example, children who may play sports competitively. There are what we call world schoolers that move, that go to different cities and travel. There's all kinds of different homeschoolers. But again, this is a very, very American idea. Homeschooling is becoming more popular worldwide as well, particularly in countries like Russia and Brazil. There are homeschooling movements that are tied mostly to religion and the idea that children should be taught based on Christianity. And those ideas come from the United States. There's a movement that was founded in the United States that is now appealing to these countries, and so many parents are starting to homeschool for religious reasons in those countries. But in most of Europe, homeschooling is illegal. In China, it's illegal. And there's actually been some interesting court cases and things in the United States. And the one that is the most prominent, that you hear the most about, is a family from Germany. Very large family that held very strong Christian beliefs. And that family actually came to the United States and applied for asylum because they could not homeschool their children in Germany. It's against the law. And the court in the United States originally gave them asylum. That was later overturned, but that they got work permit and permission to stay in the United States. And so they're now living in the United States as family. And there are news articles every couple of years about their legal fight, because there still is a fight whether they will be able to stay based on fear of persecution if they went back to Germany, because the family believes so strongly in homeschooling. They believe that this is their duty as a Christian family. So yeah, there's not really much to compare this to internationally, because it's very rarely done internationally. The research here in the United States is also really fuzzy about homeschooling. The most of the research has been done by a scholar called Brian Ray, and he has done a lot of studies that show that homeschoolers do better, a lot better academically, that they do much better in these standardized tests. They, they're better adapted, really glowing results about homeschooling. The problem with those studies is that they are not free of bias, and they are not scientific studies. So Brian Ray is an avid homeschooler himself. He has a business and a website promoting homeschools and then how good it is. And his sampling was also bad. So what that means is that he got participants for his research using Christian homeschool associations. That does not include nearly all the homeschoolers. By some account, only 34% of homeschoolers now homeschool strictly for religious reasons. Most homeschoolers do not, and that's a change that's happened over the last few years. The samples that he got were not from the population at large. There were also not scientific studies. When you do any kind of research study, you have to be really careful about how you ask questions, how you analyze the results. For a study to be really strong, a study like this that looks at things like test scores and results, many times you would get a statistician involved and very big technical analysis, and none of that was done. It was pretty much a homegrown operation, using, again, families who do not represent all of homeschooling and who likely had positive experiences with homeschooling because they chose to give results. People who had negative experiences with homeschooling are not going to vote to show off their children. And to be part of the study, they had to do a lot of testing and get a lot of data, and parents who are not very invested or who don't have the time to be super invested in their children's education wouldn't do that. But in any case, those studies do show positive. Those are the only large studies that have been done. Coalition for Responsible Home Education, CRHE, did a kind of a survey study, and this is a group that advocates for regulation in homeschooling, and it found overall positive results, but these were not based on academic scores necessarily. They were based on things like, did you have a good experience with homeschooling? What are you doing now? Do you have a career? How's your family life? All of that. There have also been anecdotally some really negative stories about homeschooling. In almost every school I've been at, in fact, I think at every school, because homeschooling is a big trend in the South, there have been, every public school, there's been the story of one or more students who really struggles, and that student was homeschooled, and basically homeschool for that student was not school. That student maybe did modules on a computer, the student just pressed answers until they got it right, or that student was unschooled, which sometimes that's meant to be that the student just does what the student wants and they don't learn how to read or write or do math. That's on the low end. And then on the more extreme end, there are children who have very strict worldviews because they have been isolated as homeschoolers. And in East Tennessee, I unfortunately saw some of this. There were students who had very limited knowledge of how the world works because they were homeschooled in a very, very strict Christian worldview. They didn't have interaction with other students, and that was by design. They were not supposed to interact with other students because, again, these students were seen as a threat. And it was always kind of like a self-segregation case. And then the most extreme are cases of child abuse where homeschooling is used as an excuse to abuse children. That's very rare, but there have been big coalition for responsible homeschooling. I think they have maybe over 200 cases. So it is relatively rare, but it happens. Kind of anecdotally, I have seen homeschool be remarkable for students, and students do really well, and students who are really involved with their community in a way that they probably wouldn't have been if they were in public school. I even know some students who are becoming teachers who were homeschooled. because they care that much about the community, and their parents did not do it to isolate them or out of hatred for the school system, which is something that's also unfortunately found. There's a lot of hatred in some of these homeschoolers, but because they wanted to do something that would help their child the most. And they have the qualifications to do it. These parents often have a lot of education. They have the resources. One parent can devote themselves pretty much full time to homeschooling. I've seen it done beautifully. I've seen really good results. Again, in a way that these students probably wouldn't have done as well if they were in a regular school setting. And then I've also seen kids who, get to 10th grade and can't do basic math. So if you're a parent that's considering homeschooling, I really urge you to consider what that's going to look like for you and if you have the resources. There are now certain Christian groups and denominations that pretty much mandate that your child has to go to private school or homeschool, and sometimes private school is not an option either economically or because there's not one in the area, Christian school. And if someone's pressuring you to homeschool and you don't feel like you have the resources to do it, don't do it, because there can be harm. And you're not a bad parent if you can't homeschool. It's okay. I think there are a lot of parenting choices in this world today, and there's a lot of judgment. And you're not a bad parent if you decide to do something that's against what people in your community or your family tell you. On the other hand, I will never, ever, ever justify people who homeschool and do it to isolate their children, and who do it with such hatred that they actually will not have anything to do with people who public school or with public school teachers. I know one really sad case in East Tennessee where there was a retired teacher who was not allowed to see her grandchildren because they were homeschooled, and both parents had the idea that the grandmother was evil because she had been a public school teacher, and so she had to have these bad ideas. Again, that's very radical. I don't think that's most homeschoolers, but those things exist. And there is a movement for more accountability towards homeschooling. In other words, to have some more regulations. And I believe there needs to be more guidance. Sometimes people will just pull kids for homeschool, especially if they've had negative experiences with the school system, especially children who maybe have special needs. Parents just say, well, I just had it with the school system, and they pull the kid, and then that kid doesn't get what they need because there's not really always a lot of guidance set up. Sometimes there is. And co-ops and things that exist to help homeschoolers often helps with that. But again, homeschooling is a personal choice. I do think it can be good in some situations, and it can be bad in others, which is just like any public school or any private school. There are awesome public schools out there. There are terrible public schools. There are awesome private schools and charter schools. There are horrible private schools and charter schools. Each parent just has to do what they feel is right. So that's all for today. And I would love to hear about homeschooling in your country or your state, or if you have any interesting stories, please comment below. And please like and subscribe if you're interested. And until next time, keep learning.